Hi, and welcome to Recognizably Jewish, the podcast about Jewish culture. I'm your host, Jason Spitelnik. This is episode 10, Sholem Aleichem. Here's my plea to you. Don't skip this episode. You may not know who Sholem Aleichem is, or you may just assume he's a fusty old Yiddish author. But if you've ever laughed at an episode of Seinfeld or Curb Your Enthusiasm, you should know about Sholem Aleichem. If you've ever enjoyed a movie by Mel Brooks or Woody Allen, you should know about Sholem Aleichem. If you've ever appreciated a book by Philip Roth or Jonathan Safran Foer, you should know about Sholem Aleichem. If you've ever chuckled at a self-deprecating joke told by Rodney Dangerfield or Joan Rivers or Jon Stewart, you should know about Sholem Aleichem. Plus, this is the second episode in our informal series leading up to an episode about Fiddler on the Roof. The first was episode 8, which was about klezmer music. If you haven't listened to it, I highly recommend it. And a quick note, throughout this series, I'm relying pretty heavily on Elisa Solomon's book Wonder of Wonders, A Cultural History of Fiddler on the Roof. It's a great read. I'll include a link to the book in the show notes. Before I begin, let me ask a favor of you. Please follow our Instagram page, which you can find at Recognizably Jewish. There's a great community of Jewish content creators on Instagram, and getting follows and views and likes will really help me get the podcast to a wider audience. Thank you. And with that out of the way, let's dive in. Part 1. Solomon Rabinovich. Solomon Rabinovich was born on March 2nd, 1859, and grew up in the shtetl of Voronkiv. At the time, the area was part of the Russian Empire. Today, it's near Kyiv in central Ukraine. His father, Nachum, was a middle-class merchant when Solomon was born. Nachum had a Hasidic upbringing. The family spoke Yiddish at home and sent Solomon to a local cheder. But Nachum had some exposure to the modernizing Haskalah movement, and he encouraged his son to learn Russian and to read secular books. After graduating from a secular Russian high school in 1876, Solomon worked as a teacher and a tutor. He also worked as a reporter for the local Hebrew weekly, writing mostly about Jewish education. His goal at the time was to become a successful writer in Hebrew or Russian. In 1883, he married his student, Olga Loyev, the daughter of a wealthy Jewish landowner. A few years later, the couple inherited her father's estate. The year he got married, Solomon published his first work in Yiddish. He had discovered an issue of a Yiddish-language St. Petersburg weekly and realized that the Yiddish language and its literature had wide accessibility and appeal. Yiddish was, after all, the lingua franca of Jews throughout the Russian Empire and elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe. He realized it made sense for a Jewish writer to write in Yiddish for a Jewish audience. That said, at the time, Yiddish literature was considered low status. In fact, many Yiddish writers used pen names to preserve their respectability in Russian literary circles. In keeping with the tradition, Solomon Rabinovich assumed pseudonyms when he wrote in Yiddish. He tried out a few, including Solomon Bickerfresser, which means Solomon the Book-Eater, and Der Yiddischer Goslin, the Robber Jew. In the end, the one that stuck was the sardonic pen name Sholem Aleichem. Sholem was his first name, Solomon, but the complete phrase Sholem Aleichem is a greeting that literally means peace be upon you, or idiomatically something like, how do you do? If you've ever heard someone say Salam Aleikum in Arabic, it's the same thing. Let's do this episode's Yiddish phrase. Listen carefully and see if you can figure out what it means. I'll reveal the answer at the end of the episode. Today's phrase is, Sieben Töchter ist nicht kein Gelächter. Part 2. The Rise of Sholem Aleichem. Sholem Aleichem's first full-length novel, Natasha, was published in 1884. A few years later, he moved his family to Kyiv, where he continued to write and began dabbling in the stock market with his father-in-law's inheritance. At some point in the early to mid-1880s, Sholem Aleichem had conscientiously decided to do what he could to elevate the status of Yiddish writing. The consensus intellectual view at the time was that Yiddish was a vernacular jargon that was good enough for pulp fiction, but unfit for higher art. Sholem Aleichem didn't buy it. He saw a coupling between the growth of Jewish nationalism in the Russian Empire and the rising standing of the Yiddish language. He wanted to foster the creation of a Jewish national literature, and he believed that Yiddish was the only language up to the task. As he published his work in Yiddish newspapers and magazines in and around Russia, his popularity grew steadily, not only in the empire, but throughout Ashkenazi Europe. 1888 saw two meaningful accomplishments in Sholem Aleichem's Yiddish literary project. First, he published the inaugural volume of a new Yiddish literary almanac, the Jewish People's Library. He leveraged his position as the editor of the almanac to find and mentor talented Yiddish writers throughout Russia. Second, he published the Yiddish language novel Stempenyu, which today is widely regarded as his greatest full-length work. The novel portrays an aborted love affair between two married Jews. Stempenyu, a talented, philandering, itinerant klezmer violinist, and Rachel, a pious young villager stuck with an inattentive husband. Stempenyu was based on a real klezmer musician of the same name, a man who came from generations of klezmorim and led his own successful klezmer kapelier. The book was a big hit, and it was Sholem Aleichem's first literary work to be translated into other languages, including German. Sholem Aleichem's renown was spreading further. But in 1890, the stock speculating he had been doing went awry, and he lost the entirety of his family's fortune. Sholem Aleichem was suddenly hiding from his creditors, and financial uncertainty would dog him for most of the rest of his life. Part 3. Tevye is born. In 1890, Sholem Aleichem moved his family from Kiev to Odessa, where his wife set up an illegal dental clinic. For his part, Sholem Aleichem kept writing. The 1890s were somewhat less productive than the 1880s had been, but they produced two characters of great importance to Sholem Aleichem's career. One was Menachem Mendel, a naive and optimistic schlemiel with a tendency towards impractical schemes, get-rich-quick dreams, social ambition, and a tragicomic approach to life's challenges. The basic blueprint that Sholem Aleichem created with the character is evident throughout later Jewish literature and film. The other character Sholem Aleichem developed in the 1890s is inarguably the most important development for purposes of our particular story. Notwithstanding their financial hardship, Sholem Aleichem and his family spent summers in the resort town of Boyarka. While there, he got to talking to the elderly man who delivered his milk every day. Those conversations gave him an idea for a character. In 1894, Sholem Aleichem published the short story Tevye Strikes It Rich, a monologue in which the main character, Tevye, is relating an old story of his to a silent listener named Sholem Aleichem. The story is about a time Tevye, then a deeply impoverished log hauler, met two women lost in the woods and gave them a ride back to town in his wagon. It turns out the women were relatives of a wealthy Jew who rewarded Tevye's favor with food and cash, which Tevye used to buy a milk cow. It is in that way Tevye's origin story, explaining how he became the dairyman he was in future stories, including the ones adapted for Fiddler on the Roof. Tevye Strikes It Rich is a funny, lighthearted story. The eponymous narrator is a folksy raconteur full of scriptural mistranslations and malapropisms that would have been uproariously funny to the contemporary Yiddish-speaking audience. Tevye maintains his good cheer and his Jewish faith despite all that has befallen him, so who can begrudge him a bit of harmless kvetching? Over the next 2 decades, Sholem Aleichem wrote another 7 Tevye monologues. Each successive publication added layers of complexity to the main character, to the supporting cast of his family and his fellow villagers, and to the greater social context of the pre-Soviet Russian Empire. Tevye was convinced to invest in a disastrous financial scheme. His daughters sought to upend the long-standing tradition of arranged marriage. Tevye was widowed, and so on. Using the veneer of the gossipy dairyman, Sholem Aleichem gave birth to so much of what remains poignant about Jewish humor. There is a clear through line from Tevye's self-questioning, self-deprecating personality to the stand-up comedy of Rodney Dangerfield, to Woody Allen's Alvy Singer, and to George Costanza and Larry David's character in Curb Your Enthusiasm. Sholem Aleichem's fusion of tragedy and comedy set the stage for thousands of Jewish jokes that make light of the many disasters and calamities Jews have confronted. And Tevye's penchant for ironic detachment is a clear precursor to the work of so many Jewish humorists, in whose work Jewishness is simultaneously embraced and distanced. It's no wonder Harvard professor Ruth Weiss called the Tevye monologues the anchoring work of the modern Jewish canon. Part 4. The Illusory American Dream. In the early years of the 20th century, Sholem Aleichem worked on other series as well. He published numerous Yontif stories, stories published by the Jewish press on the eve of Jewish holidays, and he created a series of stories about the fictional but quintessential shtetl Kas Rilevka, located in the author's words, exactly in the middle of that blessed pale. In 1905, Sholem Aleichem remained financially overextended, and his physical and mental well-being were diminishing. He decided to see if the theater could improve his fortunes. That year, his play, Scattered and Dispersed, was staged successfully in Warsaw. Sholem Aleichem began planning a collaborative effort to launch a Yiddish theater in Odessa, but the Tsarist regime ultimately didn't allow it. 1905 saw widespread pogroms throughout the Pale of Settlement, including in and around Kyiv, where the Rabinovich family lived. That was also the year of the abortive First Russian Revolution. With the empire and his own personal fortunes in chaos, Sholem Aleichem moved his family to Geneva. He then went on to London, where he saw a performance by the great Yiddish actor Jacob Adler, a towering figure of the thriving Yiddish stage in New York. Sholem Aleichem continued to believe that his fortunes would be made in theater, and so in October 1906, he set sail for the first time to New York City. His initial reception in New York was heartening. His works had been published in the American Yiddish press for years by that point. Yiddish and English reporters interviewed him at his brother's apartment in the Bronx, where he promised to write for the Yiddish stage. Sholem Aleichem attended a number of galas in his honor. Although it's unclear who came up with the term, someone dubbed Sholem Aleichem the Jewish Mark Twain, and it stuck. The comparison was apt in many ways. Both were humorists, both used pen names, and both produced great literary works using vernacular language. Supposedly, Sholem Aleichem responded to the comparison by noting that Twain, in fact, was the American Sholem Aleichem. Unfortunately, Sholem Aleichem snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. He made patronizing remarks about the state of the Yiddish literary and theatrical scenes in America, and the two plays of his that were staged, including a theatrical adaptation of Stempenyu, were critical and commercial flops. He returned to Geneva in the summer of 1907, generally no better off than he had been when he had first arrived in New York. Part 5. The Legendary Funeral. Sholem Aleichem continued to write serialized novels in order to keep afloat. He also continued to work on plays, including drafting a script to dramatize the Tevye stories. At the same time, he toured Central and Eastern Europe, traveling from town to town as a sort of one-man show. He was a bona fide celebrity. As Hillel Halkin writes in his introduction to a collection of Sholem Aleichem stories, it is a matter of record that the Jews who heard him read his work at public performances not only laughed until their ribs ached at his unsparing portrayals of their ingenuity, anxiety, tenacity, humanity, unplumbable pain, and invincible hopefulness. They emerged feeling immeasurably better about themselves and their fate as Jews. Nevertheless, it was an exhausting existence. Sholem Aleichem contracted tuberculosis and was largely bedridden for several years. The one bright spot during this otherwise difficult time came in 1909, when a committee of his friends and supporters bought back the publishing rights to his writing from various publishers. That enabled Sholem Aleichem to publish his collected works to earn a modest but steady income. World War I broke out in the summer of 1914. Sholem Aleichem moved to New York City with his family, living first in Harlem and later in the Bronx. He signed a contract with the Yiddish newspaper Der Tag and continued writing. He undertook reading tours outside of New York. Sholem Aleichem contracted influenza in 1916 and died on May 13th. His funeral is the stuff of legends. The procession from his home in the Bronx to the cemetery in Brooklyn attracted hundreds of thousands of New York's Jews, including important cultural dignitaries. The YIVO Encyclopedia of Jews in Eastern Europe describes it as an unprecedented demonstration of the size and cohesion of New York's Yiddish-speaking population, no longer a conglomerate of rootless immigrants, but rather an organized community joined in their grief for the loss of a great artist. Elisa Solomon writes that Sholem Aleichem's funeral gave stage to the community's need for collective mourning. In his will, Sholem Aleichem left a Yiddish rhyme to be inscribed on his gravestone. In translation, it reads in part, "Here lies a plain and simple Jew who wrote in plain and simple prose, and while his grateful readers laughed, he wept in secret and alone." Part 6, Legacy. The Tevye stories never made it to the stage during Sholem Aleichem's lifetime. But in August 1919, Yiddish theater legend Maurice Schwartz opened his season with a production of Tevye the Dairyman, using the script Sholem Aleichem had drafted. It was an unqualified commercial and critical success. That led Sholem Aleichem's widow, Olga, to grant Schwartz the American theatrical rights to Sholem Aleichem's full canon. Of the many plays Schwartz produced based on Sholem Aleichem's writing, a 1923 production of Stempenyu is notable because the set designer, Boris Aronson, had worked at the Moscow State Yiddish Theater at the same time as Marc Chagall. You'll hear his name again in our episode on Fiddler on the Roof. Successful productions based on Sholem Aleichem's works were also put on in Warsaw and Moscow in the 1920s. And in 1939, on the eve of World War II, Schwartz made a movie version of Tevye the Dairyman, and its dark themes were consonant with the horrifying news out of Europe. In his will, Sholem Aleichem directed that no monument be erected in his memory, stating, "The best monument for me will be if my works are read." After the war, Sholem Aleicham's work was made available to a new generation of Jewish audiences through English-language translations and theatrical adaptations. His reputation remained intact, if not ascendant. Of course, that changed with the opening of Fiddler on the Roof in 1964. Thanks for listening to this episode. It would be an enormous help to the podcast if you would subscribe for free to our Substack at recognizablyjewish.substack.com. Before I finish, let's not forget this episode's Yiddish phrase. Sieben Töchter ist nicht kein Gelächter. It means 7 daughters is no laughing matter. Thanks for listening to Recognizably Jewish.